All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today here for Avoiding OSHA PPE Fines, an NRCA webinar sponsored by GAF. My name is Paul Delano. I'm an Associate Marketing Manager here at GAF. I work in the commercial division, but we're going to cover both commercial and residential today. Harry is of the NRCA, and Harry and I have been doing these for, gosh, couple years now, so you may have heard our voices before, but we're happy to have you again. And if this is your first time, welcome. Harry's always chock full of good info, but we'll get to him in a second. A little bit of housekeeping. During the webinar, if you have any questions or comments or technical issues, use the webinar chat box, and that chat box is at the bottom of the screen. If you click the word chat in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom, that'll prompt you with an area where you can enter any of those concerns. The chat box will open up and remain open for the duration of the webinar. If you happen to close it out by accident, you can open it again from down there as well. This is how we're going to talk to you guys throughout the webinar, so please utilize that section for that. So as I mentioned, Harry's with us today. He's the Director of Enterprise Risk Management at NRCA. Really knowledgeable guy. We've been keen on a whole bunch of different safety topics over the years. This one is one that hits close to home and one that has some of the biggest OSHA fines. So I flipped through Harry's presentation, and it's another great one. So we're happy to have him on board. NRCA is one of our vendor partners, and we're always on the same page in terms of safety and importance of safety for all of our contractors and people in the roofing industry. So this is just a small way to keep that going. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harry. We're going to go through the presentation, and then at the end, we'll have questions, but feel free to send them in throughout the webinar, and we'll hold them till the end, and then I'll read them out loud to Harry. So with that, Harry, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it, and thanks to GAF for having me on again. I don't know how many of these we've done, but we've done a series of them in the Commercial Roof Safety Guide webinar series, and today, what we're going to talk about is personal protective equipment, PPE for shorthand. And I usually, in almost all of these webinars that I do, I usually come up with some either stats from Bureau of Labor Statistics, or this is from OSHA. These are the OSHA citations that are most frequently cited by federal OSHA, so in those federal states, against the roofing industry, against companies that are in the roofing industry. So just quickly, every company has what's up at the top. You see that NAICS. It's a North American Industrial Classification System code, and so every company has a code like this that's used in BLS, and it's used by OSHA. So there's different codes for, say, like if you're an HVAC contractor, if you're an electrical contractor, carpentry, roofing. So how I can get at these then, it's just on OSHA's website. You can go to OSHA's website at www.osha.gov, and you can get through their website into what they call frequently cited, kind of just a portion of their website, and you can search then by this NAICS code and see what they're issuing citations on. And you can also get specific there. You can also search, do an establishment search. If you want to find out, details on, say, a company, on your company, what's up there, you can do that through OSHA's website too. So it's kind of good to know. But I put this up there so you can kind of see why we're doing this on PPE. PPE has grown in significance in terms of what we're worried about are injuries and obviously even fatalities in this situation. But we focus it because we know that if OSHA is issuing citations, it's something that they're going to be looking at as they come on a job site. And what drives it is the fact that, I don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg here. Does OSHA give more citations because people are being injured? Why is this happening? Or do the citations just basically, reflect that? Or what exactly, how does that come about? But if you look at this, the total in fines, now this is from the last fiscal year, the last full fiscal year. So October of 2017 to just a couple months ago in September of 2018. And you can see for roofing contractors cited by federal OSHA, there was almost $25 million in fines assessed. And so that was about 3,300 inspections, and about almost 8,000 citations were issued. So you'll see that each inspection will likely have multiple citations. And so how this has happened over the years that I've been doing this, usually the first 4 citations, you'll see the first one is duty to have fall protection ladders, training requirements under 503, which is the fall protection training requirements. And then usually number 4 was the thing that's down a little ways, where you see general requirements in 451, 926-0451. That's a scaffolding citation. So usually the top 4 for like the first maybe, I don't know, 13 years that I've been doing this, the citations were duty to have fall protection ladders, the 503 training requirements under fall protection, and then scaffolds were always number 4. Well, for the last like 2 or 3 years, scaffolds has kind of been pushed out, and the greater amount of citations have come under eye and face protection for that number 4 spot. And if you bump down just a little, you'll see head protection is down just a little ways, 1926-100. You'll see there were 600,000 in fines for those type of citations, for obviously a hard hat citation. So the eye and face protection is basically safety eyewear, and we'll get into what that means. But basically, the PPE area, this shows for the last fiscal years, has produced $2 million in citations from federal OSHA. So almost, not quite, but almost 10% of the penalties issued, and not quite 10% of the well, maybe it is 10% of the total citations issued in the roofing industry are related to PPE. And you know, just think of it in terms of let's say you go to any job site, how easy would it be to get a citation where maybe a worker is doing something and has flipped their safety glasses up on top of their head or on their hat or whatever. And, you know, it's an easy citation to spot and an easy citation to for them to enforce in terms of at the review commission or beyond. So it's pretty common that you'll see some of these. So that's why we kind of wanted to focus on these. We do kind of a lot of different areas here in the webinars, but PPE is something that it's an easy one for them to cite, also kind of an easy one for a contractor to fix or to solve, and it just increases worker safety. So I kind of start with that just to see where we're at in terms of what OSHA is doing for citations, and obviously we want to avoid citations and we want to keep workers safe. So let's get into what exactly we're talking about when we talk about PPE. And if you've been familiar with any of the OSHA regulations, OSHA kind of has this thing that they don't specifically call it out, I don't think, in the regulation as a hierarchy of controls, but it's something that OSHA is behind a lot of their regulation, that there is a hierarchy of controls for hazards. And it's common in, for example, American National Standards Institute, the Z10, Safety and Health Management Systems standard. You'll see a thing on hierarchy of controls. In international standards, ISO 45001 also has a concept of the hierarchy of controls. And the idea is that the last thing, and that's what this triangle is meant to depict, the last thing you want to do is to use personal protective equipment because it requires a worker to do something. And when it requires a worker to do something, that kind of puts the human element into it. So when we have somebody who has to wear personal protective equipment, we worry because of, you know, are those safety glasses going to be on top of their head? Is the harness going to be hooked up to a lifeline? You know, all of this stuff that it has some type of influence on what that worker is going to do exactly. So the reason it's one of the last things we want to do is because it's got that human element. There could be a flaw there. So what is preferred is, under this hierarchy of controls, is the first thing that you do is maybe try to eliminate the hazard. So the hazard is either done away with through a process change or maybe a product change, something like that. So think about, let's say in our industry, You can have issues with, say, a flammable bonding adhesive. So for single ply, you have a flammable bonding adhesive. You can eliminate that flammable issue, that hazard from flammability, by switching to, let's say, a waterborne bonding adhesive. Okay, so that eliminates that hazard. Let's forget about any of the other technical aspects that might go with that. But the idea is the elimination is going to remove that hazard. And that can also be, so there can be a lot of different engineering controls that come into it, you know, with ventilation, whatever it might be. So you try to apply those first. Then there's things called administrative controls and work practices. And probably it requires the worker or the employer to do something. Probably the best example of that is, let's say, in the noise or hearing loss area, in the noise control area, an employer could set it up so that because a worker can only be exposed to so much noise, that workers may get rotated through a job or through a task so that their time spent in an area where there's a high hazard for noise is minimized by the act of that employer moving that worker out of that hazardous atmosphere. So again, why that isn't that great of an option all the time is it does what? It requires the employer to do something or the worker to do something and say, oh, it's an hour, my time is up running this machine, I got to get and do another task because otherwise I'll be exposed to noise that's too great. So as we talk about the PPE, think about it in terms of what OSHA is requiring. They're requiring something else in advance of maybe the use of PPE as they go about and determine what the hazards are and how they're going to approach them. But I just wanted to kind of let you see where that picture kind of comes from. So in terms of protecting employees from workplace hazards, as we get to the PPE thing, it's an obligation on the employer to protect those workers from the hazards. And in this particular case, what we're talking about is falling and flying objects, things that can, debris that can shoot around from just being airborne naturally at a job site, or from tools like grinders and drills and saws, harmful substances that may be used, whether in removals of roofs or installation of roofs, and then noise exposure. You know, if you've been on a roofing job, you know that there's roof cutters and gravel sweepers and rockers and all sorts of equipment that makes some noise. And so that's going to be something that, for the most part, in a lot of these instances, there may not be an engineering control that can be applied against some of these processes that go on. So that's why we start looking at it, start thinking about the use of personal protective equipment. So I've got two slides up here in terms of the responsibility, and the key responsibility is with the employer to you know, assess that workplace for the hazards. So what are the things that are going to be hazardous to those workers who are up on the roof? And if there are no engineering controls that can be applied to that situation, or administrative controls, then what's going to be used in terms of PPE? How is that worker going to be protected? And it may be a combination of a couple things. So a lot of times ventilation, for example, may remove some of the harmful, or a portion of the harmful stuff that's in the air, but it may be that that worker still may need to use a respirator. So that employer has to make that determination. And of course, under the OSHA rules, and this was changed about, I think, 6 years ago, OSHA redid the personal protective equipment, the subpart E, to specifically state these provisions of payment for PPE and lay out, you know, the employer's obligation to pay for it. When does the employer not have to pay for PPE? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's something the employer is obliged to do, as well as, you know, training for the use of PPE. You know, what are specifically, you know, probably more common with respirators, where there's some kind of technical aspects for the use of respirators. Not so much with like safety glasses. I mean, you kind of put them on one way and that's about it. But still, that worker has to be trained in PPE and how it's to be used, you know, noise protection, things like that. And then the employee has obligations too to use that PPE the way they were trained to use it, and you know, follow it according to what that employer has trained them, or what that, say, manufacturer has maybe provided training on. And then also it's the employee obligation to inspect that daily and maintain it in clean and reliable condition. Now, there may be some overlap here too, because the employer is also going to be checking that those workers on kind of a daily audit, job site audit, that worker is doing what? Wearing the safety glasses, wearing whatever, the harness, whatever it is, in terms of any type of OSHA requirement. And they're maintaining things like respirators in proper shape. The training is basically a training on the hazards. Okay, so what are the things that worker is going to encounter on the job? And then also what's missing here is, because it jumps right from the hazards to the PPE options, is, well, are there going to be any engineering controls or administrative controls in here as well? So we've kind of jumped from hazards to PPE options in selection, and that may not always be the case. So these are the things that the worker's got to be trained on. How are you going to use that piece of equipment? What do you have to do to take care of it? If you have a respirator, change out options on filters and cartridges, things like that. And what are the limitations of PPE? Okay, what kind of things will you not be protected against? So that's part of the training. And as we talk about, we talk about this when we talk about fall protection, we talk about it in different subparts of the OSHA rules, that oftentimes when an OSHA compliance officer comes on a job, they're going to look at something from the point of view of the substantive violation. Okay, so is that worker using a proper respirator? And they're also going to be looking at it from the point of view of, was that worker trained in the use of that respirator? Because they sort of get two bites of the apple then. They can get the citation, and that's why you often see on the inspections, there's more citations issued than inspections, because they're getting kind of two shots at this. They're getting a violation for the substantive thing that was wrong, whether it's wrong glasses, wrong respirator, wrong hearing protection, and then the fact maybe that they'll want to see if they can get a training violation as well, because they can kind of get two shots at that situation that maybe produces two citations. And it's a pretty common thing that they want to make sure that worker is trained, and that's oftentimes a totally different obligation. As we saw the first slide with the OSHA citations, it's like in fall protection, you can get a violation under 500, 501, 502, and then you can get a 503 violation, which is a training violation. So you didn't have the warning lines at the right height, but then you also didn't train your workers on what that height should be, and so then you get a training violation. So no real difference in PPE. That the training kind of goes hand in hand with the thing that you're trying to get them to use, or the procedure you're trying to get them to follow. So in subpart E, the first thing we want to talk about is head protection. So on the most common violations, we saw it was eye and face protection. So this will be kind of different. We'll talk about this. This was the second thing where there was about $600,000 in fine. But I'll start with head protection, because this is kind of the one that seems to be the easiest to spot. But this is 1926-100 in subpart E, and basically we're talking about the use of hard hats. And I've just got some screen captures of different hard hats that are out there. Things that you may see on the job where there's a face shield combined with it, or there's hearing protection combined with it, or some type of warm weather or cold weather accessories that go with that hard hat. And that's kind of important, because a lot of times it may not be, and you'll have to check on your manufacturer's instructions, but a lot of times, especially as the weather gets colder, what you're doing, if that worker is, say, wearing a hoodie or wearing some kind of knit hat, is that okay with the manufacturer in terms of the use of that hard hat, that they wear some type of liner that hasn't been approved by the manufacturer and still provide the head protection that hard hat has been tested for under another ANSI standard? So that's why I've got some of these pictures of this, the one thing in the middle, that kind of blue thing, is kind of a insulating hood made by a manufacturer specifically for use with a hard hat, one of their hard hats. So it's something to be aware of, because if there's stuff going on and the hard hat is placed on top of a hoodie that's on top of a knit hat, especially in cold weather, is that hard hat going to be as effective if something happens to hit that worker? So that's going to be something that can often be an issue. The main thing is, and what we see a lot is, especially in roofing, because in roofing, many times there's nothing above that worker to provide some type of hazard. But in a lot of cases, like some of the photos here, If there's some kind of a possibility that worker could get struck by something, whether it's a crane or a hoist or sometimes low-hanging pipes that are on a roof, or if they're in a confined area where there's pipes going through, or HVAC systems or something that they could hit, water tanks, all that sort of stuff. There could be a possibility there, and that's what the OSHA regulation says. Is there a possible danger of head injury from impact or from flying or falling objects, electrical shock, burns? If that's the case, then those workers have to be protected by a hard hat. So we see it in two instances the most, as we get calls in on folks who are possibly going to be cited for a hard hat violation. It's usually one of two things. It's usually there's a crane that's landing loads or removing debris from a roof, whatever. So there's a crane in operation, or it's that there's a worker on the ground who is picking up debris, loading it into the dumpster, or possibly staging materials, sending material up on the crane or whatever. So it's that ground worker who's doing something, or maybe those workers on the roof when there's a crane or something like that could provide a hazard. So when that's the case, then OSHA says, well, that worker has to be protected. And OSHA cites an ANSI standard. ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, and ISEA is International Safety Equipment Association. So they're the two secretariats, if you will, of this standard, Z87.1, which is the hard hat standard. So the OSHA, and so their current standards, there's a 2009 standard, 2014 standard. And so these standards get reviewed by committees, by folks who are in construction, folks who are in manufacturing, to determine, how these hard hats are tested and what's the test protocol. So there's scientists in this thing, and they come up with how these things are rated and what the protocol is for rating them. So right now, the OSHA regulation, if you went to 1926-100, you would see OSHA cites Z89, 1997, 2003, and 2009. So they've cleaned that up a bit because the old citation, it was like a 1969 standard. So they've moved it forward because these things get revised. ANSI revises these standards like I forget what it is. It's 4, 5, or 6 years. I forget if it's a consistent number, but it's every so often these standards come up for reauthorization, or they get totally revised, and then they're issued under a new year. And then the manufacturer manufactures this piece of equipment. They put a label in it that says this complies with the testing requirements under ANSI Z89 2014 or whatever. So that when you buy a hard hat, and if you went out now and bought a hard hat, more than likely you would see a label in there that says Z89 2014, because that manufacturer is trying to keep up with the most current testing protocol that ANSI establishes. So the two types of hard hats, you'll see here, type 1 and type 2, and basically it's just a test protocol that's different in each. So it's an impact protection, and with the type 1, it's impact protection on the top, meaning basically a 3-inch circle at the top of the helmet is the thing where the test, some kind of test weight or some kind of like a penetration piece of steel is put against it in an as-worn position. Type 2 is that test is applied to the top and to the side and off center as well. So it's a little bit more protective of a test protocol. And as you see it says in an as-worn position, and that's one of the things we get asked about the most, or people ask about the most, is, well, can I wear my hard hat backwards? And if you've ever been on a job site, guys who are steel workers are constantly have their hard hats backwards because they have to see what's in front of them. If they're making connections, they usually flip it around because the bill gets in their way of what they're looking at, and that happens sometimes in roofing. But if the hard hat has this emblem on here, these kind of two arrows chasing each other in a circle, that means that hard hat has been tested in a bill forward or bill backwards configuration. So however that worker determines that he or she wants to wear that hard hat, if it has this symbol on it, they can wear it backwards or forwards, and it provides the same amount of protection. So in the old days, that could have been an OSHA citation if a worker had a hard hat on backwards, because they weren't, until these newer standards came out, they weren't tested in that configuration. So if the manufacturer happened to test them in that configuration, it would void the citation, but that'd be kind of rare. But now if a compliance officer sees somebody wearing a hard hat backwards, one of the first things they'll do is look inside the helmet and see if they see this symbol here. So that's kind of something to kind of be aware of. In terms of the electrical protection, it's going to be something that maybe some of you guys might be interested. So Class C means it's basically one of the lesser protective hard hats. It has no electrical protection. G and E have, G of course is a lesser protection at 2200 volts. Class E of course for significant protection at 20,000 volts, so 20 kilovolts for 3 minutes. So in both of those, and for some folks that'd be something that they may need in certain jobs, but for the most part, it's going to be a Class C helmet because you may not need that electrical protection. So now we get to the top, let's say, citation provider in the frequently cited, and that's eye protection. Again, we're still in Subpart E. This is 1926-102. But this has been rewritten recently as well to kind of change a little bit in terms of what OSHA has in terms of descriptors in the regulation, those of you who are familiar with it. But OSHA basically requires the employer to make sure those workers are using some type of eye or face protection when they're exposed to some type of hazard from, say, like debris, flying particles, molten metal. If somebody's welding, sometimes you can get slag that's popping off from that. Liquid chemicals, so solvents, things like that, bonding adhesive, whatever it is, acids, caustic liquids, chemical gases or vapors. So that can also be from solvents. That can also be things that if you're welding, say, stainless steel, if chromium-6 is an issue there that maybe requires some type of eye or vapor protection in that regard. And potentially injurious light radiation. So if you're doing welding, again, that's why there's specific requirements for welding shields, for specific shades on the welding helmet. So the eye protection, and this is another thing that's pretty easy to check, because a lot of folks will come onto a job site and they have sunglasses on, and the employer will want to know, if it's not something that he or she has provided, what is the nature of those sunglasses? Are they sufficient to meet the OSHA regulation? And OSHA basically says that eye protection has to meet ANSI Z87.1. So they have a 1989, 2003, 2010. Current OSHA, or the current ANSI standard, is 2015. So it's been revised just 3 years ago. And again, if you get eye protection, more than likely it's going to be determined, or let's say testing sampled under the latest standard. But it's something that the employer has to assess to see if that is actually a Z87 piece of equipment, and the worker can know pretty easily too. Another thing to remember before I go on, the side protection is required when exposed to flying objects. So a lot of, and you don't see it so much now, because now the style of the safety glasses is to kind of wrap around. But those of you who've been around for a while know that there used to be the straight safety glasses. And if you were doing something like with a grinder, or say like a router or a circular saw, that stuff is going to be flying at you from all different directions. So side protection is required. So not so much a big deal now, because most of the eyeglasses now that are out there have that curve to them. So when we talk about the ANSI standard, Z87 has basically a basic impact category and a high impact test category. So something could be Z87 compliant, but that might be either a basic impact compliance or a high impact compliance. So if you look at, say, a pair of safety glasses or a pair of goggles, a face shield, there'll be an imprint on there that says either Z87.1 or it'll say Z87.1 plus with a plus sign. So the plus means that it got the impact testing on it. So the basic impact test, you can see the lenses are tested separately. The high impact test tests the lenses in the frame, okay? And that's kind of significant, I guess, from a scientific point of view in applying these tests. And again, I'm no scientist. So they do something in terms, there's something physical that makes it more significant if it's a high impact test with a lens in the frame. So the basic test, again, you can see the difference here and why it's pretty significant. But the basic test is a drop test of a 1-inch steel ball, drop 50 inches onto that lens, okay? That's the basic test. But the high impact test shoots a 1/4-inch steel ball at 150 feet per second. So it's, again, a little more significant of a, well, actually a lot more significant of a test, I guess you could say, for the high impact to earn that Z87.1 plus mark. And what you'll see as these screenshots here that you see, it's kind of hard to tell, but Z87 will be marked on that side part of it that goes over the ear. It'll say usually Z87 on there. On the goggles, on the face shields, it'll usually be imprinted into the whatever that is, the plexiglass, the Lexan, or whatever that is that comprises that kind of more the lens portion of the piece of equipment. So you'll be able to see pretty readily if that's compliant or not. So it's pretty easy to determine that. Welding shields, this you have to go to, if you go to 1926-102, there's a table, E1, that has different types of welding procedures and the shade number that is on there. So, you know, the greater the radiant energy coming from that specific weld procedure, then the shade number will be increased. If I have that right, the shade number will be greater or darker for a higher radiant energy. And then of course there's more protection involved there too, because you know, as you weld, there's all sorts of spatter coming off and slag coming off that's, you know, going all over you. So that's why welders, you know, they're wearing an apron, heavy gloves, and a kind of a, you know, large helmet to protect them along with that shade. So the welding shield is something that is critical in terms of the use of welding and in terms of the type of welding you're doing. So let's jump ahead now. We'll talk a little bit about hearing protection. These are all specific things, you know, section 100, 102, hearing. We have some specific OSHA regulations that are written on these. On some of the other stuff where we're talking about, say, like gloves or say even long pants, long shirt, things like that. Some of it is more like an industry best practice for what you're doing. But some of this we're talking about because it's got a specific OSHA regulation that's been written for it. And 1926-101 is one of the things on hearing protection. And it relates to subpart D, which is 1926-52, where there's a table in there, table D2, that says how many decibels for how long. Decibels are a measure of noise in a certain area. How much noise can a worker be exposed to and for how long of a time? So in the OSHA rule, in D2 right now, the least amount of noise is 90 decibels. If you look though at some of the more current ANSI standards, that number is 85. So folks who are in safety, as from like industrial hygiene point of view, more in terms of let's say safety professionals, they're looking at that initial threshold of noise at a level of 85 decibels versus OSHA, which sets it at 90. And so then as the level goes up, so a worker can be exposed to 90 decibels for 8 hours under the OSHA rule. As those decibels go up, the exposure time is reduced until it gets up to a high enough number. The worker can only be exposed for, say, like 15 minutes for something. I think it's like 114. I'd have to look at it right now to be certain. And then there's an impact noise that they cannot be exposed to. So say like a jackhammer noise or something like a pile driver, something that provides impact. So table D2 is kind of the thing that you have to go to see what the permissible noise exposure is. And if you've exceeded that, then you're talking about some type of engineering controls if possible, but more than likely some type of hearing protection. And that basically comes down to earmuffs, earplugs, and canal caps. So each one of these has its own, let's say, pluses and minuses. You know, earplugs are pretty cheap and simple, but you can get, those of you who hunt, you're probably aware that there's custom molded, or hunt or just shoot. There's custom molded earplugs that get a little pricier, but they're much more effective. There's earmuffs that provide noise protection, and canal caps, which are pretty similar to earplugs, but they're not inserted quite as the same way as the earplugs. But each of these things that are produced by a manufacturer for noise protection comes with this thing called the noise reduction rating, and it's listed on the packaging that comes with the product, and you'll see here the NRR of 32. So ordinarily, how that would be, let's say you're using a piece of equipment that puts out, let's just say 132 decibels. If this had a noise reduction rating, you would take that 32 of the noise reduction rating and subtract it from the 132, and you'd have 100. So that would then tell you how long that employee could be exposed, because you're over 90, so you still have to reduce that employee's time with that piece of equipment based on that noise reduction rating, eliminating some of the harmful noise. Now, OSHA says that NRR cannot be accepted as that raw number that is on the packaging. They want it reduced by a minimum of 7, so then this would be actually 25, so you'd take 132 minus 25. But OSHA then strongly recommends, now this, again, this is not in the standard. You will not find this in the standard that it says this recommendation. And again, because it's a recommendation, that doesn't mean that it has the force of law as let's say the rules that are specifically in the regulation. So that it recommends a further reduction of 50, so that 25 now becomes 12.5. So you can see the significance, because say you had 132 as a decibel level, and now you just reduce it by 12.5. That worker is severely overexposed at that point to whatever that is, 120 decibels or 119.5, I guess, if my math is correct. So you have to keep that in mind in terms of the reduction, and the reduction that OSHA recommends. So, and for a couple reasons. In this instance, we're talking somewhat about the citation, but we're also talking about, let's say, the worker injury point of view. You know, if you're giving a worker some protection that's really not going to protect them from hearing loss, that's going to be pretty significant from the point of view of that worker being injured, workers' comp repercussions of that. And so it's something to keep in mind that these things are not to be taken as written in stone, these noise reduction ratings. Remember that it comes with some caveats as to the use of them. Hand protection is another area where we don't really have a specific requirement there in terms of a regulation. I've cited this 1926-95, and that's kind of the opening section, or the opening paragraph to subpart E in terms of personal protective equipment. And it talks about the workers being protected from hazards by whatever type of clothing, you know, they might need, you know, whether it's gloves, or whether it's, some type of other protection for their arms or legs. So it doesn't get specific, but it's something that's going to maybe cause cuts, or it's going to maybe cause a burn or some type of chemical contact, that we're going to have to make sure that we have some type of provision to determine what we're going to do with that. And for the most part, the things that we're going to look at first in a lot of these situations are our safety data sheets. It's the last bullet that I have on this slide. But our safety data sheet is going to tell us exactly what is in this thing that we're using, what is in this chemical that we're using, and why do we need hand protection, and what type of hand protection. So a lot of times that product that you're using, the installation product, is going to tell you what exactly you're doing in terms of the PPE for your hands. Now, the drawback is, in a lot of, let's say, tear-offs, say you're doing a roof removal, well, you don't know exactly what you're tearing off. So, you know, a different type of glove might be used in a tear-off than on an installation, right? You might just have, like, say, a heavy leather glove on certain tear-offs, but on other things, you know, if you're putting down, let's say you use a heavy leather glove, if you're putting down, let's say, a torch down, but you might use something like if you're putting down bonding adhesives, maybe some type of other glove, nitrile or rubber or whatever, but it's going to be based kind of on what that product tells you. What does the manufacturer say you're supposed to do in that safety data sheet? So a couple different types of gloves that are available. There's stuff with, you know, anti or cut resistant fabric, like Kevlar, Nomex, Cuttex for sharp metal protection. So if you're doing metal work, that might be appropriate. I've already mentioned the leather gloves for things like torching and basic removal, things like that, BUR, hot work. And then those rubber gloves or some type of synthetic material that's going to prevent that chemical contact with the skin through the hand. So the hands are one area where we don't get the specificity in the standard, in the regulation, but it's going to be something, again, that we got to go to our safety data sheets and find out, well, what exactly is the manufacturer telling me that I've got to worry about here? And foot protection also, you know, there's an OSHA regulation, but it's basically cites an obsolete ANSI standard that doesn't even exist anymore. So the current standard for foot protection is actually an ASTM standard. So ASTM, you know, we kind of think of more in the technical realm in terms of, say, like roofing materials. You see a lot of ASTM standards cited. This is one instance where we have an ASTM standard in the foot protection area, in PPE area. So F2412 and F2413 are two areas that kind of describe how safety shoes basically are built, what's the particulars that relate to them. So the hazards we're looking at with regard to foot protection are going to be the stuff that's on just about every job, heavy objects that might roll on a person's foot, or equipment that might roll over, sharp objects like nails or metal piercing the soles of the shoes, hot liquids, hot or wet surfaces, slippery surfaces. So there's nothing in the OSHA rule that tells us, for example, and we talk about this here a lot, that says, for example, well, we have to have a steel-toed shoe in all instances. Well, there may be, because it doesn't tell us that to use that all the time, there may be instances in roofing, for example, if you're somebody who does a lot of shingling, a steel-toe shoe is not something that's going to be your first choice of what to wear on that shingle job because of what that does to your foot. It actually might be more injurious to your foot than anything that's going to roll on it that day. But that's something that employer is going to have to make the assessment for. It's going to be kind of unusual on a shingle job to see steel-toed shoes all the time, but it may be something that employer might determine that would be useful. Another big area where we do have a specific regulation is for respiratory protection. So again, in situations where there's, let's say, gases, dust, vapors, mist, stuff that's floating around in the air, the first thing that OSHA is going to want to see is some type of engineering control. So can that thing that's floating around, that material, chemical, whatever it is, can it be eliminated through some type of engineering control? And enclosure and ventilation, kind of rare in the roofing industry. Obviously in the shop, there's ventilation possibilities there and enclosure possibilities. Not so much really on a roof, but there may be instances where that might apply. But there might be a situation where a less toxic substitute might come up. As I mentioned before, let's say swapping out a waterborne type of product for one that's based on petroleum. So if a worker is required to wear a respirator, that employer has to have a written respiratory protection program, okay? So in terms of, again, simple citations, things that are simple for OSHA to cite, simple for them to prove, if a worker is required to wear a respirator and there is no written respiratory protection plan, that's going to be kind of an automatic citation and an easy citation under 1910-134, okay? So that's the citation. If you look to the construction standard, 1926-103, we just put it up there just because it's in the construction regulation, but that basically cites you over to the general industry rule at 1910-134, okay? So the key thing, and we'll get into what is actually supposed to be in there in that written respiratory protection program. But if you're doing things, let's say you're doing things with whatever, you're for some reason you're doing an asbestos job, you're requiring a respirator, or you're doing something that involves silica and you've required a respirator, you've got to think about the repercussions of all that in terms of how that works in relation to the equipment that worker is going to use. So it's not something that just is that worker is given a respirator and now you're okay. You have to have that written respiratory protection program. And then it also triggers things like, well, how do you know that worker is okay to wear a respirator? Because again, a respirator makes it a little harder to breathe because you're breathing through a filter and a cartridge. Even on a dust mask, you're breathing through a filter of that dust mask, so it's a little harder to breathe. So that worker has to be evaluated for using a respirator. And then you have to check, does the thing fit okay? Is it, in other words, is a worker breathing through those cartridges, through the filter, or are there gaps in the respirator where the worker is actually breathing air directly from the outside because the respirator is not fitting right? And then what type of respirator are you using? There's a lot of different varieties. So the first thing is the assessment of that atmosphere, okay? And that's something that has to be done initially. And if the levels of whatever the contaminant is aren't reduced below the permissible exposure limit, then that's when the respiratory protection comes into play. And so the program, the respiratory protection program, when respirators are required, program has to be written and include the procedure. So how do you select the respirator? So what are the procedures you're going to use to select? What's the elements that go into the selection of the respirator? Is it going to be just an air purifying one, or is it going to be a supplied air one? What's the nature of the air? Medical evaluations, can that person use it? The fit testing, is it sealed up properly? Procedures for using the respirator, because some of these can get complicated. Cleaning, storing, and repairing procedures. Again, there's something that has to be cleaned, has to be swapped out with cartridges and filters on a regular basis, kind of related to the air quality, quantity, and flow, because if the filters, the cartridges get clogged, then that's going to reduce that flow of air. And then the workers are going to be trained in these hazards. What exactly is this thing that we're being protected against by the use of the respirator? And so there's also an evaluation process in that program to go back and see if this respirator program is actually effective. Is it doing what it's supposed to do? So now, when a respirator use isn't required, so the workers want to use a respirator voluntarily, and is it okay to just say, well, yeah, go ahead, you can wear the respirator, no problem. But OSHA says you still have to do some things that are in the written program, even if you're just using a respirator because a worker wants to use it. The first one is a medical evaluation. You can't just have this worker wear a respirator without being sure that that's healthy for that person to do, that person is not going to have other issues by wearing that respirator. And then the training, worker training has to be provided on the cleaning, the storage, the maintenance. You know, when do I swap out filters? What do I do with this? How do I clean this thing? What do I do when I put it away? And this applies, and this last bullet here is important, because even if you're voluntarily using some of the other respirators, like a half mask, you're applying this. But if you're just voluntarily, say a worker just says, I just want to wear a dust mask today, I just feel like wearing, if it's not required by the employer, these things then don't apply. So these parts of the medical evaluation doesn't have to take place. It's not going to be a big training thing. So voluntary use of the filtering face pieces, which that's what OSHA calls them, but basically dust masks. So if it's voluntary, but keep in mind, if it's required, if the employer says, I'm telling you guys, you got to wear dust masks. Well, now that triggers all this stuff above, the medical evaluations, okay, the fit testing, all of that, because it's required use, okay? So that's an important thing to remember because it's pretty significant in terms of the obligation that's required of the employer and the employee and the worker who's using that thing. It's pretty significant. So just some, quickly, just some examples here. A full face piece is this one on the top on the left in the black. Again, it provides eye protection and it's respiratory protection. Supplied air, the guy in the middle in the beige, you can see the hose coming into the unit that's basically supplying air because for whatever reason, he's in an atmosphere where he shouldn't breathe that air, and an air purifying respirator is not going to make that air okay. Half mask respirator, probably one we see a lot of in most situations. It doesn't have eye protection, but it's got the pre-filter, the white part, and then there's a cartridge in there, depending on the nature of what the thing is that worker's breathing in. The one right below that, that's a powered air purifying. So for folks who may have difficulty with a normal respirator because of the effect it has on let's say, the heart rate or whatever, a powered air purifying respirator pumps the air into that face mask, so it makes it easier for them to breathe and it doesn't put the strain on their body. And then, of course, the dust mask. And those are kind of, there are a lot of different varieties of those. This has the exhale valve on it, so some people like those, but basically rated, pretty much the same. So last thing I want to get to is employer payment for PPE. So 95D, that sets out the employer obligation, and it's pretty specific. So if there's PPE that's required under subpart E, that employer has to provide that PPE to the workers at no cost. The employer isn't required to pay for, kind of things like everyday clothing. So jeans and winter coats, raincoats, things like that. That's not something, although let's be honest, it's technically PPE, but it's not something the employer is required to pay for. Replacement PPE has to be paid for by the employer, except when that employer can show that the workers lost it or intentionally damaged it. So it'll be in those situations where a worker has lost glasses on a regular basis or things are damaged intentionally. But in say like the situation with gloves, say you're doing hot work, gloves get changed out quite a bit when you're doing work with hot asphalt, right? Because they get messed up. Same with maybe you're doing bonding adhesive. Bonding adhesive gets all over and it's hard to use the gloves. Another thing is the worker can provide his or her own PPE, like say a special hard hat. They want to get a hard hat with whatever, their favorite team's logo on it. The employer isn't required to reimburse the worker for it. They may if that's their company policy, but OSHA doesn't require them to buy something that, the worker has picked out as something that he or she likes. Say they buy a pair of Oakleys that are, $150, and although they're safety glasses, the employer isn't on the hook for that just because that's what the worker wanted. But they will be obliged to pay for those basic things that are required under subpart E. So those common OSHA citations, no eye protection and it's basically nailing, grinding, cutting, welding. That's the kind of thing where eye protection is going to be pretty obvious. We'll also see sometimes a compliance officer, even if somebody's hand nailing shingles or shakes or whatever, they might say something about that in terms of eye protection because of a flying hazard with nails. Obviously not as great with an air-powered nailer, but still it might be something where you might get some compliance interest. Head protection with overhead and other hazards. So if there's a crane on the job, be aware of that. If you've got ground guys who are scrapping the ground downstairs, putting things in the dumpster, no hard hat is kind of a no-brainer. That's going to be an easy citation for that compliance officer. And then with respirators, it can be a lot of things related to that program. It may be that there's no respirator that was even there was no assessment of the hazard, so that's one violation. But then, if there is a respirator in place, was there fit testing, medical evaluation, and training for that? So I just want to stress again to the importance of safety data sheets. What OSHA says, Section 8 of the new format of safety data sheets is supposed to have in there, you know, in terms of what are their recommendations for PPE. And here's just a sample of one that says, here's what you're supposed to wear. You know, goggles must be worn. If you're wearing contact lenses, some type of gloves will provide protection. So it's going to be laid out in the safety data sheet as to what they're requiring. So in summary, for the things the employer has to do: assess the workplace for hazard, use those engineering controls, work practice controls to eliminate or reduce the hazards before using PPE. So we want to apply that hierarchy of controls initially. Select the proper PPE that those workers are going to be using. Tell them about what those hazards are and why the PPE is necessary, how to use it, what are the things that they have to know. Train them how to use it, how to care for it. And then the follow-up, you know, you have to do the job site audits to make sure, well, are they wearing the glasses? Are they wearing the respirator? All that. So that's kind of part of the OSHA obligation as well. So I know I had a lot there. I kind of sped through a lot of it, but I'm happy to, if you've got questions, just fire away. I'll try to answer them in whatever, until Paul tells me to stop.
Thanks, Harry. No, I appreciate it. Lots of good stuff. And everybody, thank you for sending questions so far, and please continue to do so. So let's just get right into it, Harry. One of the questions from Matt was, if the employer provides PPE to a subcontractor on the job site and they later get caught by OSHA for not using it, who's responsible for the fine? Is it the sub or is it the employer?
Yeah, that's a good question. It kind of goes beyond subpart E. It goes beyond that subcontractor-contractor relationship, and that gets into a pretty deep area in terms of control of work, because what OSHA is always going to try to do is make that contractor-subcontractor relationship equivalent to employer-worker, okay? Because if it's employer-worker, then the main contractor can get cited, because as is often the case in the sub is not the deeper pocketed entity in those situations. So the OSHA may try to get it into that worker employer situation. So it's kind of it's not a simple one to answer. I can't say, oh no, it's going to be the sub. But in terms of you know, how OSHA would see that, if it was purely a contractor subcontractor thing, OSHA has a couple ways they can proceed. They can cite the subcontractor because it was his or her employee who wasn't wearing the safety glasses, okay? But then OSHA also has what's called a multi-employer citation policy, where if you can cite the one who exposes their worker, but you can also cite a contractor who has control of the job site. So OSHA's argument would then be, to get kind of a 2 bites from the apple, is we're going to cite the contractor and the subcontractor, because the subcontractor obviously violated his obligation to the worker to provide PPE, and the contractor who was in charge of the job had control of it, and he or she should have controlled that subcontractor and enforced those rules. So that would be kind of the OSHA perspective, what they would like to do. So again, hard to give you an answer, but that kind of gives you the questions or the steps that OSHA would go through in terms of citations.
All right, great. We got a couple more, so thanks everybody for sticking around. If an employee provides their own PPE, such as a hard hat, who's responsible for making sure it's compliant? Is that the employee or the contractor?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I should have mentioned that. So in those cases where, you know, we had it in terms of payment of PPE, but the employer is going to be the one who is got to look at those Oakleys or look at that hard hat that has the team logo on it and make sure that the eyeglasses are Z87, make sure that the hard hat is Z89. Because again, this is going to fall on the employer that it's not an issue of payment, it's an issue of, is it compliant? So is the worker protected under the proper type of PPE, using the proper PPE that is called for in subpart E? So great question, and it's going to be something the employer's got to look at that stuff and say, hey, let me see those glasses, because if they're not compliant, you're not wearing them.
Great. Couple quick ones here. Can buying a specific PPE be part of qualifying for a job? When is that ever required to be hired?
Yeah, in terms of buying a specific manufacturer?
Or if you didn't have a protective mask, but it's going to be part of the job, can that be put on the employee or the contractor that's required to buy?
Yeah, ordinarily, like a lot of times, if say like you go on a job site, you know, where a GC is on the job, you know that once you walk through that construction gate, you have to have your hard hat on and your glasses. So ordinarily, that's going to be something that initial employer is going to require of his or her employees, because it's probably a contractual item for them. So I don't want to get too much into that contractual stuff, because it's not really appropriate for me to go there. But it's something that if it's required by your employer, whether it's under their contract obligation or not, it's something that they have to provide payment for.
Sure. Okay. So another question: would a generator or compressor require hearing protection, or would they have to know the decibel number before figuring that out?
Yeah, you kind of have to know what that's producing. And there's even apps for your phone that will kind of act as it's not real sophisticated, act as a sound level meter and give you an idea of what that thing is putting out in terms of decibels. So there's an app that I think NIOSH has that tells you what the decibels are in a certain instance. But there's sound level meters that you can get that are, I think we bought some not too long ago for our OSHA 10 hour, and I think they were like $30. And it gives you a kind of an idea of what kind of numbers it's throwing out. And ordinarily it will be useful for at least getting you in the ballpark for what those numbers are.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're going to have to call it there, everybody, but I appreciate everyone sticking around a little past 3. I want to thank Harry again for putting on a great show. And as you can see, his email is up here. So if you have a question, we ran out of time, please feel free to send it to him and follow up that way. So appreciate it, Harry, and appreciate everyone taking the time today to learn a little bit about fall protection and PPE.
Thanks a bunch. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.